Good afternoon, and it's Monday 15th of October 2012. Welcome to UK Column Live from the Plymouth studios. Your hosts today, myself, Brian Gerrish, and Mike Robinson. And as you can now no doubt see, it's a little bit chilly in the studio today, so I'm fairly well kitted out. Sunny outside, so we hope it won't stay too cold for too long. But there we are. Well, amazing events are now occurring in Britain, and Mike and I earlier on were discussing over a cup of tea the fact it seems to be becoming easier and easier to actually start to see what is being done. Britain is now under attack from its own MPs as there is a major drive to destabilise the country, and of course in the background we've got attempts to break up the union itself. And our lead story today is David Cameron travelling to Scotland to sign the Scottish independence vote deal. What is fascinating about this story is, of course, that Cameron is doing this with absolutely no proper debate in Westminster. And if we read some of the comments in the press around this, I'm looking at the Telegraph at the moment. We've got that the Scottish vote comes despite no referendum being offered south of the border. It says that an ICM poll earlier this year showed that more people backed Scottish independence in England than in Scotland. And so the key bit is what is going on. At the moment, Cameron hasn't had any proper debate in Westminster over this potential breakup of the union. What do you think is happening, Mike?
I think it's interesting that, I mean, you and I have a different view on who should be consulted about this. I mean, ultimately, in the first instance at least, it should be a Scottish decision whether there's Scottish independence. But actually, I would be sad, and actually it goes a bit further than sad. I think it's important that the union is not broken up. This is an agenda that seems to go right across Europe to break up nation states. We're seeing the same thing in Spain with Catalonia. Even the Cornwall argument is the same kind of argument. We want to, we're breaking up nation states in favour of regionality within a pan-national European Union as a first step to something bigger. And it's part of the same agenda as gives Nobel Peace Prizes to the European Union. I mean, it's nuts. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of interesting stuff in this article by the Telegraph. It's pointing out that Cameron went to visit Rosyth, where the aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth is being assembled. So remember, Cameron got rid of aircraft carrier capability. We've lost all of that training expertise. That was all scrapped. The maritime patrol aircraft just scrapped, and now he's up there having a look at the carrier being built, and of course using it as a bit of a stick to beat the Scots with, saying, well, of course you're going to lose contracts if you go independent. We've also got Sir Malcolm Rifkin coming out of the woodwork, former Scottish Secretary and Foreign Secretary. Now, Rifkin always appears when there's some sort of dirty manoeuvring going on in the background. Lisbon Treaty was one of the key ones, but here he is popping up in the background now. So what is actually going on? But something which is very interesting, it says, the most recent poll on independence suggests support for leaving the UK has dropped in Scotland. A survey of 995 adults published last week showed support for the union at 53%, compared with support for independence at 28%. But of course that shouldn't be a problem for any vote within the European Union, because if you don't get the right response the first time round, you simply hold another referendum.
Or you rig the vote.
Or you rig the vote. The Express was the newspaper that seemed to get a little bit deeper into events concerning Scotland, and they've come up with a very good article which is talking about what the cost would be if Trident nuclear submarines have to be removed out of an independent Scotland, and it's claiming that it would cost the taxpayers 25 billion. It was also pointing out that pulling the 220 nuclear warheads from storage in Faslane and Coalport would be absolutely vast. But there's something, I can't put my finger on it. I'm going to say there's something very casual about what's happening. The potential impact on the United Kingdom, obviously, of Scotland breaking away would be vast. But we've got statements like this in the Express article. It says, Lieutenant Colonel Crawford said he compiled a report into how the military would look in an independent Scotland, along with economist Richard Marsh, as the SNP had failed to provide any detailed plans. And the report predicted Scotland would have between 10 and 12,000 troops, a navy of 20 vessels, and an air force of only 60 aircraft. So a MOD spokesman says no plans for independence are being made, as the government is confident that people in Scotland will continue to support the UK in any referendum.
That's a fairly staggering statement.
Incredible, isn't it?
I mean, surely, unless you know the outcome 100%, you're making a risk assessment for any eventuality. Surely, in the event that a referendum is placed in front of people, you don't know the result, supposedly. You must have a contingency plan for the vote going against the way you think it's going to go.
Well, if you're going to lose your capability for a base for the nuclear deterrent, I mean, either they're expecting the nuclear deterrent already to be gone by the time there's independence, or they think that the vote 100% is going to go one way. Yeah. Which is it? We don't know. No. So we come back to the point that really here we have absolutely vital matters going on, the breakup of the United Kingdom, independence for Scotland, but also the future of our independent nuclear deterrent, and we don't see any substance in the debate. Meanwhile, Mr. Cameron has recently been visiting the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, which is just down the road from our studios here in Plymouth. This is a picture from the Western Morning News, which did a very impressive article on his visit, because basically it was pointing out that whilst Mr. Cameron was at Dartmouth saying how proud the nation was of the Navy, 30 miles away in Plymouth is a vast naval base, 330 hectares, by far the largest naval base in Europe, which effectively sits empty as Cameron has stripped away Britain's naval capability. He's got rid of ships, he's got rid of aircraft, he's got rid of maritime patrol aircraft, and he's done this against the basis of yet more overseas commitments, as it was with Libya. We now see Syria coming up, we've got Iran coming up. So with one hand, he's there praising the cadets and talking about how well the Navy is doing, and with the other hand, of course, he's deceitfully cutting the British military to the bone. And one thing that wasn't picked up, but in the photograph, the gentleman with his back to you, to Cameron's left, is of course a French naval officer, and we also have the fact that Cameron has trapped Britain into a 50-year defence partnership with the French, and my prediction is what we're going to see when the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier is finally at sea. We're going to see proposals by this treasonous Tory government to have joint British and French manning. What we see is the country being sucked into a European army, a European defence setup, as opposed to our own independence. Is
this an indication of British and French training happening already? Joint training happening already?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's fair to say that, of course, with NATO, that there have been joint training exercises and programs, even for relatively young officers and other ranks. That's been going on for some time. But of course the significance is that out of nowhere Cameron suddenly announces a 50-year defence partnership with the French, and there was no debate about this. So it's quite clear that the French are starting to be fully integrated. I believe the French have been chosen for this initiative, because the British public would simply not have accepted German officers coming onto British soil in this way. Moving on, we've had a sting operation carried out by the Times, where some of Britain's senior ex-military officers have been caught lining up deals with foreign companies. Now, this was a sting operation, so the films were taken of senior officers who were being lured into the fact they were dealing with overseas defence companies who were after British contracts. I think there's more to this story than meets the eye. I think that the aim of this story was to help discredit recently retired senior British military officers in order to distance them from what Cameron and his team are doing in the Ministry of Defence. So I may be overly suspicious here, but my analysis of this is that if you want to make sure there's not going to be any danger of a coup to overturn what's going on in Westminster, then what you've got to do is corrupt the old boy defence networks. And so why was this sting operation set up? Or could it be that this is retribution for the fact that the scuppering of the British aerospace European defence deal was partly supported by retired officers? But I think there's something deep going on here.
Similar kind of operation to MP's expenses?
Yes, indeed, yeah. Well, that takes us on to Mr. Vince Cable, who's saying in very simple terms that he's worried that there's a risk of war in Europe.
So within days of the European Union getting the Nobel Peace Prize, we're starting to see the opposite kind of rhetoric coming out of politicians and leaders.
Absolutely. But of course, what is this? If you read the Independent article, he's saying that Britain could be plunged into war if the euro collapsed. You can't calculate the consequences. Europe should not be allowed to disintegrate into conflict, and there's a risk that that would happen. He said, we tend to forget until we were reminded last week that the Nobel Prize, the European project, was constructed to rescue Europe from extreme nationalism and conflict. There is no guarantee that won't return. So is this madness, this man saying on one hand that we've got to support the European project, which has now produced chaos in the streets, it's got massive unemployment, it's got a financial system falling apart, and then he's saying, well, we can't actually rely on it to keep Europe stable, but we've got to support it.
Well, I think he's giving a very stark warning to people that you will support what we do to support the euro and support the financial system, or else.
Yeah, so he's trying to frighten people into coming back in alongside the project.
Indeed, and I think that he and his establishment compatriots are very unsure as to what public opinion is going to be at the end of the day, and what people are going to accept from them in terms of future bailout and austerity, and the future manipulation into one European government.
Yeah, and of course Clegg is absolutely a pro-European man, so he's sitting unelected as Deputy Prime Minister. But these people are warning about the potential of war in Europe, and against that background, Cameron is cutting British armed forces and capability by the day.
Yeah. And of course, Switzerland is preparing for that very situation.
Yeah.
So the Swiss government has decided that the risks of conflict in Europe are extremely high, and therefore they are rearming and preparing for a European meltdown.
Yeah.
I think that says it all.
Absolutely. Now, one point that I've missed there from Cameron's visit to Dartmouth is that an admiral present during that visit says that obviously there's no money in the country and the situation is so dire, he thinks he's got a couple of commercial projects that could help save Dartmouth. So we've got the initial training centre for naval officers in Britain. We are so desperately short of money that we can come up with a sort of little project to help it run. Which planet is this admiral on? Either he doesn't look and understand what's going on in the country, or actually there's another agenda going on here that we are being fed this this propaganda. I know you're moving on to money here, so yeah. I thought I'd bring this up.
Right, so here we've got the IMF telling George Osborne to ditch his austerity programme. The IMF is warning that it's doing nothing for the British economy. Well, yes, we know that. And we know that the IMF downgraded its forecasts and actually decided last week that Britain was going to be the worst performing area of Europe. But the key thing to recognise here is that while Osborne is talking about austerity, what is he actually talking about? Because the Office for Budget Responsibility is showing that, in fact, government debt is not going to be falling over the next period of time. And in fact, that graph shows billions of pounds. So at the moment, 2012, our government debt is somewhere approaching 1.2 trillion pounds. By 2016, that's looking like it's going to be around 1.5 trillion pounds. So where is the money going? We're having cutbacks in the National Health Service, we're having cutbacks in the police, in the army, cutbacks everywhere, and yet the government is spending more and more money. What is it spending it on?
Well, we know one of the answers to that is, of course, overseas aid. And
that indeed is was highlighted by the Daily Mail today or yesterday, and overseas aid spending to overtake the police budget by 2014. What can you say? What is going on there? Well, overseas aid, of course, is not about helping overseas countries. It's about pushing the British imperialist agenda, the same agenda that the Americans are in for. So it's a kind of an Anglo-American imperialist agenda in various countries, not just in the Middle East, but in particularly sub-Saharan Africa and the Far East, some parts of the Far East as well. So this foreign aid is going over there to promote projects which promote the globalist agenda, and it's not really there to help anybody at ground level in these countries. These people are still going to starve.
Yeah. I think this is one of the important things of the programme, that in drawing together particular items from the news as being reported by mainstream, what we're trying to do is to actually put these together to show what the real picture is. And it's not until you put one alongside the other that you really start to see what's going on. We've got a government that says for Britain there's no money. We haven't got money for defence, for hospitals, for schools, for roads. There is no money, just massive debt. And yet, with the other hand, we're not talking about millions of pounds being handed out. We're talking about billions, and there appears to be no problem. Well, of course, the money is created out of nothing in the first place. So what we're really doing is talking about what is the agenda here, and it's obvious that these sorts of aid programs are not actually being used to provide people with clean water or food or the means to grow food. These are aid projects which are simply buying into countries, particularly Africa. We've chosen this story here, which of course is showing David Cameron alongside Andrew Mitchell, the man who called the police plebs. And we're still seeing at the moment quite a lot of interest in the mainstream media about why this man is still in his post in Westminster. But for me, the fact that Cameron has continued to pledge his loyalty and support for Mr. Mitchell, a man who calls the police plebs, and then refuses to actually say exactly what he did say. I should have used an alleged in there somewhere, but we know what's being talked about. So Cameron surely adopts the same standards. If this man believes the police are plebs, Cameron must believe they're plebs.
If he's supporting him in the way that he does, absolutely, yeah.
And what has Mr. Mitchell, of course, been doing in the background, which has been highly significant, is that he's actually been providing a very large aid budget to Rwanda. This will come up on screen. This is a quote from Amnesty International, but it's a result of a an article in the Daily Mail. And Amnesty International has just published a devastating report on Rwanda's human rights record. And it's saying that security forces had legally held scores of civilians in military detention without charge or trial amid credible claims of torture. The United Nations, not that we trust them, the United Nations has accused the country of arming a bloody uprising in the neighbouring Democratic Republic of the Congo. And what are we actually doing on this is that we are we're providing 16 million to that aid programme.
I mean, Rwanda, as we know, has a particularly nasty regime and some particularly nasty events there in the last 20 or 30 years. So it is an area that foreign money has been going into for a long time, installing puppet governments which are quite happy to machete millions of people to death. And I noticed in the Daily Mail article that they were suggesting that actually they used the word friend to describe the relationship between Andrew Mitchell and the president of Rwanda.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the news reports have said, people around him have said quite clearly that if you're kind to him, he's been incredibly naive and has been sucked in by the charisma of this ruthless dictator. But of course, how can you be naive if you're one of the key people sitting alongside David Cameron? Surely you should be one of the most astute people going.
Well, I would suggest that relatively benign it may be, but calling a policeman a pleb gives you an impression of what goes through this man's mind. So he quite clearly has no issue with dealing with African dictators.
Yeah. So we're on the path of money. What's happening with money? We don't think that the mainstream media is telling the truth about money and the international monetary system. And Santander has come up before.
Well, right, so on Friday night, after we did the Friday show, so we couldn't comment on it then, the deal between Santander and Royal Bank of Scotland to buy 316 RBS branches fell through. Basically, this was a £1.65 billion deal. It came about because the European Union ordered RBS to sell 316 branches in order to. Well, that was part of the deal over the UK's bailout of RBS. So it was a condition, really. And Santander pulled out of the deal on Friday because they said that they couldn't complete the deal by the deadline of 2013. And I would just remind everybody again what we've said in the past. Santander is the biggest member of the Inter-Alpha Group banking cartel, but it's also the most bankrupt member of the Inter-Alpha Group banking cartel. So my reading of this story is that basically Santander could not manage to the funding of this with
fiddle the books.
They couldn't fiddle the books sufficiently to allow this deal to go through, and it may have put them under, so they've had to back out of it. And RBS now has to find somebody else to offload their branches.
So the European Union, which of course doesn't bother to audit its accounts in the first place, 17 years with no full audited accounts of the European Union project, but that organisation then dictates what should be happening inside the British banking industry and suggests that a bank should be handed, or chunks of a bank should be handed over to a bank which is itself bankrupt.
Indeed.
Yeah, interesting. Welcome to the European Union.
Yeah.
And of course the other thing that you've been, can I gently say, banging on about is food.
Indeed. So as we know, crops significantly down this year as a result of drought in the States and in Russia, and as a result of floods in most of Europe, I suppose. And really, we produced this photograph of Obama a number of years ago, or this picture of Obama a number of years ago. But it's clear that Obama has a depopulation agenda, in fact, and Britain as well, I would say.
Yeah.
The US government has come out and said basically there's no need to worry about the fact that food stocks are down. There's no need to worry about it because the markets are functioning.
Right.
What a statement! The markets are functioning, and the statement that the American government actually made said that governments around the world, including large agricultural exporters in the G20, have exercised prudence and responsibility in policy making, including by avoiding export bans that exacerbated volatility in 2007 and 2008. So in other words, they're finding excuses to do absolutely nothing about the fact that people are going to start starving in the not too distant future as a result of much higher food prices and the inability of particularly third world and Horn of Africa was probably going to be one of the first regions to suffer. They just aren't going to be able to afford to buy the staple food that they need.
Or they're trapped with the GM seeds, so they can't actually afford to buy more seeds from what's the word, infertile crops that they've been sold.
So an absolute statement from the US government that that they're not going to help with the potential starvation situation that we have. And then following on from that, then we have this article in the Mail today, The Armageddon Virus, Why Experts Fear a Disease That Leaps from Animals to Humans Could Devastate Mankind in the Next 5 years. Now, you know, on one hand, this is a typical scare story. Yeah. But on the other hand, we're seeing through the austerity program, right across Europe and sort of the northern hemisphere, anyway, in the western hemisphere at least, we're seeing the shutdown of national health services and health services right across Europe and the States. The fact of the matter is that we are not going to be in a position to deal with any kind of pandemic of this kind. So while I do believe that this article in the Mail is just a typical scare story, I think we should be concerned about the fact that our health services are in the state that they're in, and all in the name of a false austerity that isn't needed, isn't necessary, and is part of a much bigger political agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'd encourage people to really dig in and have a look at what the Agenda 21 programme is really about, and also have a look at other alternative media which has been talking for years about the fact that there are now global corporations and governments that are talking about the need for a massive depopulation of the world. So the agenda is set out there in Agenda 21.
Well, we've got to remember, of course, that it's our own Prince Philip that has been historically right at the centre of this depopulation agenda, and other people that we know of, like David Attenborough, are absolutely at the centre of this. And you know, Philip is widely quoted as stating that he wished to be reincarnated as a virus to remove a significant proportion of the population of the Earth. They are pushing this environmentalist idea that humanity is a parasite on the planet, and that we need to be wiped out. And I think we're seeing signs of that agenda being pushed through. Yeah.
So if you haven't heard of what we're talking about before, do your own research. But if people are considering us a parasite on the face of the earth, I think we need to do something about it. Talk about it. That's one of the key things. So we couldn't do a news programme without coming on to the subject of Jimmy Savile. Obviously, the main newspapers over the weekend were literally full of it, and what we're seeing is that there's some interesting turbulence coming into the whole thing now. Some of the newspapers have certainly had a go at discrediting witnesses that have come forward, or that seems to be the slight on the stories. We've got the BBC that was sitting back arrogantly originally saying, no, nothing to do with us. We've now got them having to admit that people did know, but of course no real action was taken. We've finally got the Director General, George Entwistle, who's had to issue an apology. But the story is growing. But one of the things that you can see is that there is this focus on Jimmy Savile. There is not the focus on the ring of people that he was operating in. So I think that's going to be one of the key parts of the story. And of course, Esther Ranson is in the firing line because having set herself up to be a champion of abused people, it's now becoming obvious that if she did know anything, she didn't or couldn't or wouldn't speak out. And people are saying that actually she's not suitable to lead charities if she's not actually prepared to put her money where her mouth is, basically, and start to bring people to justice. And of course there are many other people out there who've dealt with this lady who report exactly the same thing. When reports of abuse have been made to her, she goes along so far and then no, she doesn't want to be involved. So there's some very worrying questions here. We've also now got stories emerging over Broadmoor, keys to Broadmoor, and of course at the time those keys were handed over to Jimmy Savile, we have people like Kenneth Clarke in a position of responsibility within the Ministry of Health.
Well, he was the Health Secretary at the time, so
Indeed.
he had ultimate responsibility for the fact that those keys were given to Savile.
Yeah. So it cannot possibly be, in our opinion, that Jimmy Savile was able to do what he did without massive support from other people clearly well up in the establishment around him. And we wait to see whether the police are now actually going to do some serious investigation, or we're going to see another cover-up. I think it's significant that the retired policeman who's now come forward to say he did try to get something done about it, but of course the police were not fully investigating. He comes from Thames Valley Police, the very police force that is failing to investigate the widespread sexual and physical abuse at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College. So this leads to the establishment. Will there be a proper investigation? We wait to see.
Well, we have to make sure there is.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, we've overrun slightly. We'll just finish on this gentleman, Damien Hirst, a man people will have heard of before for very controversial artwork, and one of the mainstream papers picking up on the fact that he's had a so-called work of art which resulted in 9,000 butterflies dying ultimately. But what has gone on in the background that hasn't been so reported in quite the right way is the erection of his statue in Ilfracombe in Devon. This is the picture which has generally appeared in the mainstream press.
So that was actually a mock-up. That was before the thing had actually gone up.
Indeed, yeah. We've now got the situation that the real thing is appearing, the sheer scale of it. But of course what the public is not being made aware of is that the other side of the statue that you can't see in the main press reports actually shows that the pregnant woman has been cut open, revealing her skull and also the unborn child. And this is put forward as a piece of artwork of which we in Britain should be proud. I don't know what your feeling on it is, Mike, but I think something very dark is happening here, where this perverted artwork is being sold to the country as if it's something which is uplifting and of which we should be proud. So perhaps people who feel as shocked as we are might like to contact the Department for Culture, if that name really applies. Shouldn't we be protesting about this?
Well, if there's anybody from Ilfracombe that would like to make any comment on this, of course we'd like to hear about them.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'd certainly be happy to take a local report. Okay, that brings us to the end of our news slot today. We're very sorry for overrunning. Basically a lot happening in the country very quickly. Look behind the scenes, do the research yourself, and of course talk to other people about what's really happening. Thanks for joining us.